Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for attending. I hope I have a chance to share a little bit of our journey, Zynga's journey with you, and some things that you might be able to learn from us and what we've been able to do. I think we have a slightly different story than most of the stories you're going to hear. We actually have been working with Amazon for over 6 years and have had an opportunity to really leverage a lot of what they're able to deliver. We had an opportunity to build out our own cloud and operate in a hybrid mode and really in very much of a private cloud. And a lot of things, a lot of learnings, a lot of experiments, and we've found our way back into the AWS cloud. So I'm going to share some of that with you today. My name is Dorion Carroll. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Zynga. Zynga is one of the leading social game developers for the internet. We have a number of games that entertain millions of players every day. Games like FarmVille, FarmVille 2, we have mobile versions of FarmVille now, Words with Friends, Zynga Poker, Hit It Rich slots and Wizard of Oz slots, just a number of different games in lots of different categories. And from our player-centric perspective, we want to be able to deliver those great entertainment experiences. But then on the technology front and the business front, there are some really serious challenges in how do we develop, operate, and really deliver live operations to millions of simultaneous players every day across multiple different types of game genres and different architectures that we've either evolved over the last 8 years or things that we're developing and releasing right now. Zynga's mission is to connect the world through games, and we've been on this journey now for 8 years. And we've built some of the largest games in specific genres. Zynga Poker has the largest number of daily active users of any sort of non-real money gaming poker game, a social casino game. And it's really fantastic as our first game to see how that's evolved and how we've been able to evolve that in our own infrastructure and now actually in the AWS infrastructure. So I've been with Zynga for 6 years, a little over 6 years now. I started out as the chief technology officer in the studio that was running the Mafia Wars game and really ran that for about 1.5 years from the technology perspective through its heyday and learned an awful lot in terms of how game teams work, how infrastructure has to work, how the daily operations, the live operations of 7x24 really impacts the player experience and what we can do to enhance that, both from the product perspective and then critically from the stability and scalability perspective. I spent 6 months in our shared technology group, taking a lot of our core learnings from scaling games like FarmVille and Cityville and Mafia Wars and packaging those so that new games could grow and avoid making a lot of the same mistakes, really hoping they can make new mistakes and not repeat some of the things that we had done and really accelerate our learnings. I spent 1.5 years as the CTO in our mobile division, launching 26 products in 18 months. Really leveraging a lot of the scale and the learnings that we had from our web days now with some of the new mobile technologies. And for the last 2.5 years, I've been the CIO and really focusing on scalability, efficiency, driving value for my internal customers, and then ultimately allowing them to deliver the value they need for our end user players. So I'm going to take you back a little bit, back to 2009, around when I started. Zynga Poker, our first game, Mafia Wars, a lot of other X-Wars games, so games like Vampire Wars and Street Racing that were really using the same kind of a back end that we showed we could scale. But these games were actually running in retail data centers in Silicon Valley. And we had to do everything. We had to have the people to figure out what was the next equipment we needed. We had to actually purchase the equipment, undock it, rack it, stack it, do the networking, kind of your full classic data center operations. And that was an awful lot of work that was happening at a period of time where we were fundamentally outgrowing our data centers. Our appetite for new equipment exceeded our ability to acquire that equipment. And the lead times started to cause an awful lot of stress. We actually had a number of situations where, particularly for Mafia Wars, as it was growing, potentially 500,000 to 1 million daily active users week over week, other games that were a little bit smaller would have already done some of the hardware research. They might have even racked and stacked stuff, and we would cannibalize it. We would just take it. And they said, wait, we need that equipment. It's like, well, this is more valuable. We've got more players. And it was Darwinian. That was great. I liked that part of it. But at the same time, their players were kind of getting screwed. We wanted to figure out how could we do a better job, but it was the right thing for us at that time because we really didn't have any other choices than either hit the ceiling on a game that was growing rapidly and delivering a lot of player delight and a lot of financial value, or have to sacrifice things that weren't quite as valuable or didn't have quite as many players. So not a great trade-off, but we sort of chose the path of the lesser of two evils. Sort of to the example here is my first day at Zynga was actually a day they were moving Mafia Wars, about 3 million daily active users, about 750 million to a billion transactions a day, from one data center to another retail data center down the street that had more cage capacity for us. And my first day actually became my second day because I started at 8 in the morning, went through HR orientation, met with my engineering buddy, built my sandbox, got all of those things set up, and then went home, fed my kids, came back at 8 o'clock at night, worked till 5:30 the next morning. And it was just eye-opening to see how a team was able to move something as big as that game with very little downtime. We did actually have to take the game down. And for me personally, just to be able to contribute, I actually had the opportunity on that first night. I had my sandbox checked out. I'd done a build. I had something that connected to Facebook. I had a version that ran on MySpace. And I asked the question, did anybody do any blob verification between the old data sets and the new data set? And they said, well, kind of in our dev boxes. Like, well, what about live? So I wrote some code, checked it in, wrote the unit test, verified it, ran it over 1,000 blobs, 0 variation. I went, wow, this is amazing. I get to contribute real code to real value. But under the hood, we were doing this not because our players wanted us to have a better experience for them in a new data center. It was because we just couldn't fit. And we had to actually plan things out and execute very quickly. But it was a pattern that we were going to encounter over and over again. A few months before I started, FarmVille actually launched. And FarmVille launched in June of 2009. It was the first game that Zynga launched in EC2. And it turns out that game, in a matter of months, went from 0 to over 80 million monthly active users. It was massive. I think it peaked at 33 million daily active users, billions of transactions a day, and fundamentally, at that point in time, in the data centers that we were in, had we launched that in our own facilities, the game could not have happened. It could not have become that social phenomenon. That we had the elasticity, and working closely with Amazon at that time, we were able to accumulate a lot more hardware, a lot more equipment. We couldn't have purchased it, shipped it, racked and stacked it. So that was, even going back 6 years ago, that was a huge value to us. We continued to launch very successful games on the Facebook platform, powered by EC2, using a lot of the learnings we had from FarmVille, a lot of the code learnings that we had learned from games like Mafia Wars in the past. And we were actually able to, with the massive distribution we were able to achieve on Facebook, we were able to grow games from 0 to 10 million daily users in a matter of weeks. So again, just that massive explosion of load on a specific tech stack that, although we had proven it worked in other incarnations, the games were different. They incorporated different game mechanics. Those game mechanics might actually stress systems in different ways, but we could rely on AWS to give us what we needed when we needed it, and then we could then run it there without having to focus on the racking and stacking of equipment. We got really, really good at this, and it felt really good to be able to do that. I recall, on FarmVille, really going through those sort of the first 3 million users, then the 10 million users, and the 30 million users, kind of discovering on the fly that architectural constraints that seemed to make a lot of sense at the beginning, we just slammed head on into them. And folks would work through the night. We would figure out some way to work around database connection limits or memcache latencies or other things to really move our architectures forward. And if we needed to, adjust how much equipment we were using or what types of instances we were using. Our games at the same time, like Zynga Poker and Mafia Wars and Words with Friends, still ran in our own data centers. ran on bare metal, and they were actually beginning to move to mobile. And I'll get to a little bit more about why mobile for us was a little bit of a different experience. We actually grew to a place where our appetite for EC2 instances seemed to be insatiable. We were running games with 10,000 instances, and we wanted more. We had an active game pipeline of even more, and there were sort of two things that started to dawn on us. The first is, Amazon has other customers, so they can't just keep racking and stacking everything just for us, but it was just for us for the specific types of things that we needed. And our game architectures were perhaps slightly different than what that equipment was really best suited for. And we sort of made the choice from a financial perspective and from a management and operations perspective to build out our own private cloud. And games like Cityville and FarmVille were quite large. The elasticity helped us, but at the same time, if we were going to have more and more of those, we felt we could achieve economies of scale in our own data centers. So we had started out in retail on the West Coast. We then built out our first data center in 2009 on the East Coast. We actually chose the East Coast there so that we could take advantage of direct peering with Facebook and with Amazon at that time. We then built out another data center on the West Coast, and then finally our third. And this was a journey of just building things out, moving games from Amazon into our own cloud, running some of our own systems like Poker or Mafia Wars on bare metal. And again, we got really good at scaling, and then we got really good at moving. And over the last 2 years, we've actually started migrating out of these data centers and draining them. So that skill in moving things is great. First, we focused on the data center consolidation, just reducing our footprint, increasing capacity utilization in our own cloud. And then finally, over the last probably 6 months, draining that data center and moving things into the AWS cloud. For our own data centers, and this is something that many people, when they're trying to think through, well, do I want to do it myself? Do I want to rely on a partner like AWS? We actually found that moving into zCloud was a huge advantage. We were able to select very specific hardware for our specific workloads. We were able to see between a 2 and a 3x efficiency gain. So we could migrate a workload of 1,000 instances in AWS and run it on 350 instances in zCloud. And that felt really, really good. We were able to use our virtualization layer and a lot of what we had been able to learn in running things in AWS to accelerate our own adoption of cloud practices and best cloud practices in our own data centers, running our own cloud. And we could actually continue to operate both in a virtual and in a bare metal environment. The reality was, though, that time passed, our equipment aged, we were depreciating it, and mobile was now starting to loom, and that actually suggested a different way of doing things. So over the last several years, we've actually migrated, or not migrated, we've released a lot of new mobile games. Some of our largest games, like FarmVille, Words with Friends, Zynga Poker, also have companion mobile products or fully connected mobile products. And the thicker clients actually lend themselves to much better game logic and game processing and allow us to do batching of requests that can dramatically reduce how much we have to talk between client and server. And it's reduced a lot of the load that we have. So we actually had our own data center. It was built out for these massive Facebook games. And as those games started to decline, as the audience shifted to mobile, and the mobile clients allowed for a richer but also smarter experience, we didn't need to have nearly as much equipment and infrastructure ourselves. And again, we could rely on some of the things that we were seeing already happening on the AWS front. Separately, our back-end team, so we're 4 years into our learning, we started building our own multi-tenant managed services. And the history of Zynga and our games was this notion of take what worked at scale, fork the code and run. Just go as fast as you possibly can, which meant we ended up with siloed tech stacks which worked really well for those individual game teams. But it didn't work so well if they grew really big and then shrunk. It was a lot harder to sort of disentangle the equipment, the data that they had stored. And what we wanted to be able to do then was really take advantage of multi-tenant services, take advantage of a service-oriented architecture, and based on different games and their life cycles and different loads and peaks and valleys, actually smooth a lot of the infrastructure requirements out over that kind of a service-oriented architecture. So mobile has been able to help us on that front. The other piece there is by more clearly defining request-response contracts between the mobile client and potentially a counterpart web client, we could actually define an interface and change things out as much as we wanted on the back end, whether it was just new features, new releases, totally changing a compute language, or as we've moved forward, really giving us the agility to completely change the infrastructure architecture. We're now investing in doing more and more of that, and what we found is that journey back into our own private cloud, where we were able to address some of the things that we didn't feel AWS was able to tackle for us as a specific customer, they've now nailed it. The primary reasons that we said we think we can do this better, over the last several years, they've just come back and they've hit every one of the things that we needed. I don't know how many more things. Werner said today at least 500 features and new products in the last year. We can't keep up. And so it makes a lot of sense for us to re-engage. And again, the flexibility that we had adopted in moving things around and being able to move from one cloud to another lent itself to finding a path back. For Zynga, data and analytics is a really important part of what we do. We have petabytes of player data. As I alluded earlier, individual games could be logging a billion or more transactions a day. I think at one point I recall one of the games recording about 30 billion transactions a day. Every one of those transactions went through a real-time messaging architecture, went through ETLs, loaded into our data warehouse. Our product managers were expected to learn SQL so that if there was a standard report, if a standard report didn't deliver what they needed, they would be able to do that themselves and run queries against this massive columnar data store that we had. That columnar data store was the largest on the planet, and we had 3 of them. They required a very specific networking architecture, required that they all run on bare metal. And no one had ever done this before. This was in our East Coast data center, which was the first one that we built out. It had the shortest lease, and the equipment we purchased was the oldest, so it was fully depreciated. We were replacing between 80 and 120 hard drives a month. And so there were guys just sort of constantly changing drives out. That was their life, swapping drives out. And sometimes those drive failures would cause downtime in our analytics platform. That wasn't good for anybody. So we had a year to find a new home. And we knew it would take us at least 6 months to actually complete the migration. So we had 6 months to make a decision. And we partnered with AWS. We took our infrastructure against the modern instance classes that AWS had. And the first thing we were able to do was to take our 230 node cluster and reduce it to 115 nodes. So that actually simplified some things. And our 115 node clusters turned into 70 node clusters. So we actually were able to shrink the footprint because of some of the advances that had already happened in the hardware that we hadn't been paying attention to, because that's not what we are. We're an entertainment company. We're not a technology company. We're trying to focus on better play experiences. And AWS all that time was investing in newer and better equipment. We ran 3 proof of concepts. We had 5 critical acceptance criteria that we wanted to be able to test at scale. AWS sort of helped us set up an environment. They dedicated people to us. 3 times we went through that, and we just banged our head against the wall. It's one way or the other, we weren't able to complete that. We had to make a really tough call, and we sort of said, all right, we got to go to plan B. And I didn't like the idea of going to plan B, but we didn't have the time to really enjoy spending more time on a 4th POC. Amazon came forward and said, you know what? Your data's already here. We'll do it. We think we know what it is. We'll take a little bit more time. They did that. 2 weeks later, they came back. They let us peek behind the curtain, take a look. Yes, sure enough, chuck plan B. A year later, this June, we moved our entire analytics infrastructure into AWS. on what had, prior to that, only ever operated in bare metal in a very specific kind of hardware configuration and networking configuration. I believe it is the largest cluster of its type in a cloud configuration. And it's not that that's great, it's that we actually have a partner that we can work with that enables us to do something like that that is so essential to how we actually understand our players' behaviors, understand what's happening in our games, and then deliver that directly to our product managers. And we can do that in the AWS cloud. In those 12 months, if I had had to take plan B and go forward with plan B, I would have chosen the equipment that I was familiar with. I would have chosen platter drives. I would not have even considered SSD. I didn't have the people that could help me figure those things out anymore. And by the time we completed our migration, not only would my HDD architecture for this massive and critical system been obsolete by at least a year, Amazon released 2 generations in that same year. I would have been 3 generations behind, starting a 3-year capital depreciation on millions of dollars of equipment. So it just, from so many perspectives, the speed with which we could experiment, the ability to actually run loads at scale, the dedication of the Amazon partner teams that we had, the third-party integrator that they recommended who worked with us. It's just every last thing I could think of. They just made our life a lot easier. It was never easy, but it actually worked, and it's working now. For our games, on a case-by-case basis, we actually consider what does the architecture look like in zCloud, how do we want to map that into instances, instance families, instance classes, the numbers of things, how do we want to set things up. We're using VPCs to a very significant extent, not only to sort of control the access control for any individual game, but also from sort of a billing and management perspective. I can allow a game team access to their environment, they can run everything, but since all of that infrastructure and all of that expense sits on my budget, I now have a very easy way to just charge them back. If you spun it up, you pay for it. In some cases, we've actually re-implemented back-end architectures. We've changed backing stores. We've changed from one class of server to a different class of server. We've been able to do software upgrades, and I'll get into a few very specific examples there. But the flexibility and just the number of options that we have is a huge value to us. Words with Friends is our largest game in terms of daily active users, monthly active users, people who played a day and are going to be playing a year from now. It's again, it's another one of these sort of social phenomena in the social gaming space. It runs on mobile and web. It's on iOS, Android, Windows, Kindle, Facebook. It's powered by the same multi-tenant backend. It's, as I've been told, the largest Ruby backend on the internet. It is an amazing, stable, flexible, and easy to operate infrastructure. It powers a number of our other With Friends games, and we needed to move it to the cloud. It's been running on bare metal for 6 years, and that was also one of these examples of, all right, we've never run something like this that big in the cloud. There may be other people that are running things bigger now. So we took a very conservative approach. We took a lift and shift approach. Basically said, we've got these kinds of zCloud instances, this kind of database configuration. Let's just pick it up and move it. We took a slightly even more conservative approach because we knew what instance class or family we wanted. We used the same number, but we sort of doubled their capacity. So we went from 4XLs to 8XLs and just said, look, it's going to cost us a little bit more in the short term, but it will minimize and mitigate risk as we do this migration. Sure enough, the migration was smooth. We didn't have a lot of problems with that at all. It had 0 player-facing impact. And shortly thereafter, we were actually able to switch back down to the smaller instance class. That didn't stop our look into how we can optimize and some of the things that we can do. Not only are we a data-driven company for our players and how we build our features, we're also very data-driven in terms of understanding our infrastructure, understanding capacity and utilization, and we wanted to see if we could really push it. Being data-driven and having a culture of experimentation, we actually, and I personally, love the ability to come up with a hypothesis, construct an experiment, instrument it, bring up an entire parallel infrastructure at full production scale and compare two different architectures. So we can tee traffic into a parallel infrastructure, have everything instrumented, and very quickly understand, is it working better? Is it working worse? Is it different in some areas? How do we actually want to look at that, run that for 48 hours, and then tear it all down? And if we want, we can then bring it back up. If that's the winning one, tear the old one down. If I were running my own data center, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. If I wanted to understand, well, I need to spin up, 5 petabytes of SSDs so that I can compare that to my old analytics infrastructure, that's cost prohibitive. I'm not going to find a partner that's going to lend that to me for 90 days so that I can actually stand it all up, do all the configuration, get all of those things working. So what we've been able to do with Words with Friends, we were able to take advantage of the new i2s with the SSD architecture, get away from the platter drives and a lot of the failing that we had there. We're able to upgrade to the latest AWS Linux image. This is probably a little bit embarrassing, but when we were running so many things in zCloud, we were actually on many of our servers running a version of Linux that was released before the company was founded. And we wanted, that was not everywhere, but there were definitely cases of that. And we wanted to actually be able to try things out. So again, the ability to spin things up very quickly, run parallel load against them. If we want, actually take a 5%, 10%, 50% sample in a live production load, try things out. And we found a lot of huge benefits, particularly in advanced networking, and then obviously with the SSD drives. With that, we were then also able to upgrade to a newer version of Memcache, and we saw a dramatic reduction in errors, retries, latency, and we were able to reduce the overall server farm for our application tier by 30%. And it doesn't really stop there. There's more that we can do, but the game team actually has to get back to writing features to delight players. So they sort of said, I think we've got enough for now. Let somebody else do some learning and experimentation, which is what we've done. So with Words with Friends, we actually re-implemented the community matchmaking feature that was running on over 100 database instances. It's now running on 3 instances in AWS. Why 3? Probably would run on 1. We want to have some reliability and redundancy. But 3 is a heck of a lot better than 100. We were able to update to the AWS Linux, and we were able to reduce from approximately 300 web app servers down to 200. Separately, Zynga Poker replaced a very large MySQL farm that had very specific dedicated DBA resources all over to Amazon DynamoDB. That is now a fully managed service. It's dramatically easier for us. It provides all of the same functionality. That took a few weeks. It probably took them a few more weeks just to get comfortable with the idea of changing these things out. But once they started doing it and seeing what they could do and how easy it was, it became a no-brainer. They've been able to improve cluster performance for one of our separate poker clusters. We've seen 30 to 40x improvements just by taking advantage of the architectures, the instance classes, and really the innovation and investment that Amazon has made in systems where we were running on things that were now 3 or 4 years old, and we didn't really have the people around that would help us figure out what we should do. And in hindsight, we shouldn't have had those people around. That's what AWS does. That's not what we have to do. We should be investing in great game mechanics, great play experiences, better customer service. We have, as I'd mentioned earlier, as we've moved to mobile, as our game service team in the CTO organization has matured, we've built out the service-oriented architecture. We now have many multi-tenant services, and for a lot of these, sort of behind that very clear contract with our game teams, we've actually been able to innovate very, very rapidly. We've actually converted 17 of those game services over to Amazon Elastic Cache, from what we were using before, which was a volatile cache system that was somewhat proprietary, somewhat open source, but was essentially an abandoned open source project, which meant we had to do all of the maintenance on it ourselves. We were losing internal knowledge on that system as well. And we now have a solution in both Elastic Cache and DynamoDB that can handle the vast majority of things that were really preoccupying 10, 15 people over the last several years, that we don't have to worry about that anymore. They can now shift their focus to learning how to take advantage of better AWS sources or focus on better gameplay. We actually expect that a number of our other systems will continue to follow this path of conversion. Not everybody wants to do it right away. Not all of them are convinced that their workload matches that, and that's okay, because again, we have that ability to be quite flexible in exploring, setting up experiments, and proving things out or even disproving them. Sort of going back to the Words with Friends example, they had done another iteration in terms of, well, should they get rid of all their memcache and swap it out with elastic cache? And they saw an improvement, but they felt that that improvement for them at that point in time wasn't enough to warrant changing it out. So they've got that on their back burner if they need to. But we took all of those learnings, and that's why we converted 17 of these other services over to Elasticache. I think there are probably a dozen internal services or more that we can reduce by over 75% just by taking advantage of the advancements that AWS has made where we would not have been making those same types of investments. So from my perspective, 3 critical reasons to consider a public cloud is number one, focus. Like I said, we're an entertainment company. Although technology plays a very critical role in what we do, I would rather take our best and brightest engineers and focus them on building better games or building the better back-end services at the application layer than focusing them on the infrastructure and the optimization of that infrastructure. That's just not something that's huge value add to us, but that is huge value add for AWS, and that is what they do better than anybody else that we know of. From an investment perspective, they're spending more money on that than we ever will. So it makes a lot of sense to leverage the investments that they're making so that we can focus our investment dollars on better play experiences. And then finally, this is one thing that really only through this journey dawned on me, and I've referred to it a few times. When we were embarking on building out our own private cloud, there were a lot of people who wanted to work for Zynga. They wanted to do that. That's what they do. They want to do the hardware research. They want to solve energy efficiency problems. They love building, racking and stacking and doing those things. But once we sort of hit that stasis point where we didn't need anymore, they pursued careers elsewhere because they still love building data centers, and we were now running data centers. So we had different people that like running data centers, but not those guys that were really on the cutting edge. Maybe they all work for Amazon now, I don't know. But we have lost a lot of those critical resources over the last 4 years. And if we were going to go back and reinvest in a private cloud, not only would it be massive reinvestments in equipment, which almost certainly, as I explained with the analytics infrastructure, would have been obsolete the moment we put it on the floor, we would have to be investing in people, getting a lot of those people back to do that. And again, that's just not core to our business. That's not what we need to be doing. We want to be hiring great game designers, great engineers, great product managers, and we want to be able to drive that value as opposed to the value in infrastructure that AWS does so well. So what's next on our journey? Well, a lot more optimizations, a lot more conversions to managed services. We have, as I said, a culture of learning, a culture of experimentation, and I just can't underemphasize how important and valuable it is to be able to spin up for a few days massive infrastructure that's totally different than anything you've done before, run a full production load against it, have all of your same instrumentation, and be able to do that compare and contrast, and whatever you want to do with it, just spin it back down and the meter stops running. It's immensely liberating. Then taking that the next step to be able to use that with managed services, that's also incredibly valuable to us because again, we don't have to have some of our best and brightest DevOps focused on running things. We can actually have them focused on building applications, moving them up that value stack. So they're not down at the infrastructure layer, they're not necessarily even at the virtualization layer, they're really looking at the application layer. Exploration of containers and microservices, that seems like something we really want to do, but we actually started our journey in terms of data center consolidation a long time ago. We started our journey with sort of returning to the AWS cloud, but we actually delayed it a little bit. We were working on some other priorities, and then just for fun, we pulled in our deadline by 2 quarters. And so we've compressed everything. Right now, people are really focused on making all this stuff work. Sort of one little anecdote, I mentioned to you, FarmVille was the first game that we launched in EC2 back in June of 2009. 2 nights ago, we migrated it back into the cloud. So all those players from 6 years ago and all the ones we've accumulated since, they're all now running back in the Amazon cloud. And we've actually migrated a number of things just this week, We have a few more things to go. It's been an amazing investment, an amazing journey. I think at the same time, we're actually really eager and excited to now start exploring and experimenting and trying new things out. So in summary, I mean, as you all know, AWS is a leader in cloud computing and operations. They're investing more in computing infrastructure, in innovation than we ever could. We're exploring those new services and different ways that we can put them together to delight our players. And then fundamentally, focusing what we do on our players allows us to deliver a better experience for those players, and we can rely on AWS to ensure that our infrastructure and operations teams have kind of best in class, and we can continue to innovate. And finally, I just want to say thank you. We have 2 mics here, so if you do have a question, the session is being recorded. I'm happy to answer questions. If you can speak into the mic, that way those that are listening to the recording later will know what your question was. And then otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions after that if we spin down. Thank you so much.